The sky over Kampung Manggis was blood-red that evening, as if the heavens themselves were warning of what was to come. The Maghrib Adhan rang out softly, a gentle call summoning hearts back to their Creator. In the far corner of the village stood a small, weathered surau. Inside, an elderly woman named Haja Maimuna spread her old prayer mat, her frail hands trembling slightly, but her spirit unwavering. She was known among the villagers for her devotion, always the first to answer the call of prayer, no matter how tired or sick she felt. Draped in a faded white prayer garment, she looked like a figure carved from light itself. Kneeling down slowly, she whispered praises of Allah, tears sometimes filling her eyes, not from pain, but from gratitude. To her, every prayer was a reunion with her Lord, every prostration a surrender of all worries. As she entered sujud, the wooden floor creaked beneath her, but her heart was at complete peace. At that same moment, Saka, a 17-year-old orphan boy, was pacing near the surau. His footsteps were harsh, his expression thunderous. He had become a symbol of bitterness in the village, unpredictable, angry, and untouchable. Ever since he lost his parents in a fire at age 7, Saka had hardened into something cold. Instead of healing, he let rage grow in the cavity where love should have been. No one could tell him what to do. He didn't care for prayer, fasting, or even respect. And when he saw Haja Maimuna prostrating, something snapped inside him. "Fake holiness," he snarled. He stormed into the surau, kicking the door open. The sound echoed like a gunshot. His eyes locked on the old woman. She remained still, undisturbed. Her forehead touched the floor, whispering divine names with lips that quivered in worship. "Hey, old woman, you think you're better than the rest of us?" he shouted. She didn't respond. His rage boiled over. With a sudden burst of cruelty, Saka raised his leg and kicked her, hard, between her shoulders. Her frail body crumpled forward. Her face hit the floor with a sharp crack. The sound of impact was enough to make the nearby birds scatter from the trees. Her white scarf slipped off, revealing a face wrinkled not just with age, but with decades of quiet suffering and faith. She didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. She simply wept silently as she whispered, "Ya Allah." Saka stood there, breathing heavily. He expected to feel triumph, power, something. But all he felt was emptiness. Laughing coldly, he turned his back and walked out of the surau, leaving behind the old woman sobbing on the floor. Outside, the wind had changed. The banana trees rustled as if they had witnessed something sacred being violated. The call to prayer faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Saka felt a chill crawl down his spine, but he shrugged it off, unaware that the punishment had already begun to stir, deep within the fabric of the unseen world. That night, Kampung Manggis was engulfed in an unnatural silence. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs had disappeared. Even the dogs seemed unsettled, growling at shadows that weren't there. In his small, dimly lit house, Saka sat alone near the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. The memory of Haja Maimuna's fall played over and over in his mind, but he tried to push it away. He told himself she deserved it, just like everyone else who pretended to be righteous. But beneath his denial, a quiet unease began to take root. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his back. It was so intense that it knocked the air out of his lungs. "Ugh!" he groaned, clutching the wooden wall beside him to keep from collapsing. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. Another bolt of pain radiated through his spine, sharper this time, as if something inside was twisting his bones. "What is this?" he gasped. His breathing became labored. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He staggered to his straw mat, collapsing onto it like a sack of stones. But rest was impossible. The pain was spreading to his arms, to his legs, to his jaw. Every joint throbbed, Every muscle screamed. It was as if thousands of invisible needles were piercing him from within. He bit down on his lip to stifle a scream. Blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. Outside, the wind picked up, howling like a wild animal. The bamboo walls of his house creaked under the pressure. The air turned icy. Saka wrapped his arms around himself, shivering uncontrollably. His skin felt hot, but the air was frigid. He felt like he was being pulled between fire and ice. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like leaves brushing against the wall, but they grew louder, clearer. They didn't come from the door or the window. They came from within the house, from the walls, from the floor, from the darkness itself. "Saka! Saka!" His eyes widened. He turned his head, trying to find the source. Nothing. Just shadows and silence. "Saka, why did you hurt her?" He froze. "Why did you kick a servant of Allah in sujood?" "No!" he shouted hoarsely. "It was nothing! I was just angry!" The whispers became laughter, cold, echoing, inhuman. It filled the room, crawling into his ears, bouncing inside his skull. He covered his ears, but the sound grew louder, as if it were coming from inside his own mind. Then he saw them, shadows creeping across the floor, long and crooked. They gathered in the corners, then moved toward him. Each one had glowing red eyes, staring at him with pure hatred. He couldn't breathe. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped. One shadow extended a hand and touched his leg. Saka screamed. An agony unlike anything he had ever felt exploded in his bones. He writhed on the floor, shaking violently. Outside, the trees bent under the force of the wind. Inside, Saka was drowning in fear. His punishment had only just begun. The night deepened, but for Saka, it felt like a lifetime of torment. His body shivered as if gripped by a supernatural fever. His hands clawed at the dirt floor of his hut, searching for something, anything, to ground himself. But all he found was cold soil, slick with his sweat and blood. His breath came in gasps. His chest tightened as if an unseen force was crushing it. His eyes darted around, but the corners of the room seemed to twist, stretch, and breathe like living shadows. Then came a sound, soft at first, like a knock, 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 knock. It wasn't loud, but it froze him in place. Saka's body went rigid. The knock came again, slow, steady, deliberate. It wasn't the knock of a neighbor or a friend. It was something else, something that knew he was afraid. "No one's there," he whispered to himself, voice shaking. No one could know. But the door creaked open. Not with a slam, but with a slow, agonizing groan that echoed through the room. The weak flame of the oil lamp flickered violently. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth, smoke, and something else, something rotting. Standing in the doorway was a tall figure cloaked in black. Its face was hidden beneath a hood. Only two glowing red eyes pierced the darkness. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared. Saka couldn't breathe. He tried to crawl back, but his limbs felt frozen. It was as if invisible chains bound him to the earth. The figure stepped forward. Its movements were soundless, gliding across the room like mist. The floor beneath it didn't creak. The air around it didn't move. It was like a void had entered the house. Saka's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He wanted to scream, but all he could manage was a weak whimper. "Saka," the figure whispered. The voice wasn't loud. It was softer than wind, colder than ice, but it filled every inch of the room. "Why did you harm a servant of Allah in prayer?" I didn't mean to," Saka stammered. "I was angry. I wasn't thinking." The figure stepped closer. "You touched the one who was in sujood, bowing before the Most High. You mocked the one who was connected to her Lord." Saka shook his head violently, as if trying to escape the voice. But the figure raised a long, pale hand and pointed at him. The punishment has begun. But this is only the beginning. At that moment, the floor began to tremble beneath him. Sokka felt the vibrations in his bones. Cracks appeared in the earth. From the gaps seeped a thick black smoke that smelled of burnt flesh. The shadows on the walls twisted and formed grotesque shapes, hands, mouths, claws, all reaching toward him. Sokka tried to scream. Nothing came out. The figure's hand touched his forehead. A jolt of pain, as if lightning struck his spine, shot through his body. His back arched, his eyes rolled back, and his mouth fell open in a silent cry. Darkness crept in from the edges of his vision, and Sokka knew he was no longer in the world of the living. Sokka's world had changed. He wasn't in his hut anymore. The floor beneath him was no longer dirt, but cold, slimy stone. He blinked, trying to adjust his eyes, but the darkness here was thick, alive. It wrapped around him like a wet shroud. The air was heavy with the stench of rot and blood. Every breath felt like inhaling smoke and decay. He tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him, trembling like leaves in a storm. "Where am I?" he whispered hoarsely. The answer came, not in words, but in sounds, whispers, thousands of them, whispers without mouths, slithering through the air like snakes. His name echoed among them. Sokka, 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 as though every soul trapped in this place knew him, remembered his sin, and waited to see his punishment. Then the walls began to move. From the cracks in the moss-covered stones, hands began to emerge. Thin, wrinkled, almost skeletal, with long nails stained black and red. They didn't rush. They crept, slow, intentional, as if savoring the moment. One of them touched Sokka's ankle. He gasped. The chill from its touch traveled up his leg, into his spine, freezing his blood in its veins. "No! Get away from me!" he shouted, kicking, flailing. But there were too many. They wrapped around his legs, then his arms. They pulled. His nails scraped the stone floor, leaving red trails behind. He screamed. He begged. But nothing stopped them. They were pulling him towards something. A gaping hole in the center of the room. A void. A pit with no bottom. From it came a sound. A constant, agonizing scream. And then he saw it. From within the pit rose a figure. The same figure from before. Only now it had no face. Just a black void where eyes and mouth should have been. But from that void, the same scream echoed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that shook the stone walls. The hands pulled Sokka closer to it, dragging his body inch by inch. "I'm sorry," he cried out. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I didn't know. Please!" But the figure leaned closer. "No remorse can erase what was done in arrogance. You mocked prayer. You mocked the one who listens to every whispered word. And now, he listens to your screams." With that, the figure stretched out its hand, its fingers long and sharp like blades of ice. It touched Sokka's chest, and he felt his heart seize. Not just with pain, but with guilt. It was as if every wrong he had ever done was being burned into his soul, relived in flashes. The moment he kicked Haja Maimuna, her tears, her silence, her whispered, "Ya Allah!" Tears streamed down Sokka's face, but it wasn't just fear, it was regret, heavy, crushing regret. As the black hands pulled him into the pit, Sokka's voice cracked. "Please, just one more chance." But no answer came. Only the sound of weeping souls and the cold laughter of a punishment just beginning. Sokka was no longer falling. He was sinking. Not through space, but through something thicker, darker, like black smoke that clung to his skin and choked his breath. The further he sank, the colder it became, until even his tears froze against his cheeks. Around him, shadows whispered in voices he couldn't understand. Some cried, some laughed, some simply repeated his name. "Sokka! "Saka! Saka!" He landed with a heavy thud on a floor that was soft and pulsing, like flesh. He pushed himself up with trembling arms, but his hands sank slightly into the living ground, and he pulled them back in horror. The air reeked of blood and rotting meat. Above him, the ceiling was made of twisting black veins that pulsed like they were alive. "Is this Jahannam?" he whispered. A loud, deep voice echoed from the darkness. "No, this is only the shadow of what awaits, a taste before the fire." Saka turned. The faceless figure was standing behind him again, its red eyes glowing brighter than ever. But this time, it wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the black fog. They had no faces, only mouths stretched wide, screaming silently. They circled around him, pointing at him, whispering curses in languages older than time. One of them raised its hand, and from the ground rose a mirror. But it wasn't made of glass. It was water, dark, rippling, and reflective. "Look," the voice commanded. Saka stepped forward, drawn against his will. He looked into the dark mirror. At first he saw only himself, but then the image changed. He saw Haja Maimuna in sujud, her back hunched, her old hands trembling in prayer. Then came the moment he kicked her, the way she fell, the look in her eyes, her tears, her lips silently moving with dhikr even as her body lay in pain. The image shattered, and the mirror rippled again. Now he saw a younger version of himself, angry, broken, bitter, alone, wandering, stealing, lying, hurting others without remorse. Every sin, every moment of cruelty, every arrogant word and action played before him like judgment written in light and smoke. He fell to his knees. "Please," he sobbed, "I didn't know. I was hurt too. I never knew how to love, or how to be loved." The voice didn't shout, it whispered, "Even the broken know not to harm the innocent. You chose your path." Suddenly, the ground beneath Saka began to crack again. This time it wasn't just smoke, it was fire. Red and white flames burst through the cracks, licking at his legs, wrapping around his arms. He screamed as they burned without consuming. Pain, endless and sharp, tore through every nerve. "I'll repent. I'll change. I swear. Just take it away." The shadow approached him again, placing its hand over Saka's heart. There is no repentance without remorse, and no remorse without surrender. But you never bowed. The shadow began to fade, but Saka remained, burning, screaming, trapped in that limbo of guilt and punishment. The final whisper echoed like a closing door. "This is the hell of those who mocked prayer." And in the eternal dark, Saka's voice joined the others, crying out from a place where light no longer entered and time no longer moved. "Your God won't be able to save you." The words echoed like thunder across the marble walls of St. Augustine's Cathedral, freezing every soul in their place. Father Leonard Gray, Eastern Europe's most celebrated priest, was not just a man of the cloth. He was a theological titan, a scholar trained in Rome, and a master of public debate. Week after week, the cathedral swelled beyond capacity, people standing shoulder to shoulder just to hear him speak. Not for worship, but for spectacle. And his favorite target? Islam. He'd studied it not to understand, but to dismantle. With his silver tongue and magnetic charisma, Leonard would tear through centuries of belief in a single breath, leaving Muslims in his audience stunned, cornered, and often humiliated. He made crowds cheer not with truth, but with sharp logic and emotional manipulation. One Sunday, standing beneath the towering crucifix, Leonard made a chilling announcement. "Next week," he said, voice booming through hidden speakers, "I will host an open debate. Any believer, Muslim, Christian, atheist, even a child, may step forward to prove to me who God truly is." The cathedral erupted with excitement. Cameras rolled, Social media blazed. Leonard wasn't just debating, he was inviting a showdown. Meanwhile, in a tiny apartment on the city's outskirts, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Aliyah Zara, just 5 years old, sat cross-legged on a worn prayer rug, whispering verses of the Quran under her breath. Her small hands moved gently across her lap, as her mother watched silently from the doorway. Aliyah wasn't like other kids. She didn't chase cartoons or beg for tablets. Her favorite moments were curling up next to her mother during tahajjud prayer or listening to stories of the prophets. Her tongue always hummed with dhikr, her gaze deep like still water. And when she spoke, grown-ups found themselves speechless. "She's different," people often whispered. One evening, her father's old friend Karim visited. A passionate philosophy student and devout Muslim, he spoke excitedly about the upcoming debate. "I want to attend," he said, "just to witness how Leonard twists his words. Someone has to be there to listen, if not to answer." Yusuf nodded thoughtfully. Then Aliyah, still dressed in her tiny white hijab, looked up from her corner. "Can I come too, Abi?" she asked softly. "I won't speak. I just want to listen." The room went still. Yusuf's heart hesitated. A child in a cathedral full of critics? In front of thousands? But something about the way Aliyah looked at him, calm, full of light, made him pause. He sighed and nodded. "If your heart wants it, we'll go." On the day of the debate, the church was flooded. Every seat filled, aisles blocked, cameras stationed at every angle. Outside, crowds watched on large screens. Inside, Father Leonard stood center stage, clad in regal robes, smiling with dangerous confidence. "Today," he declared, "let the world witness truth defeat illusion." One by one, speakers rose. Imams, scholars, students. All were sharp. None prevailed. Leonard deflected each with smug brilliance. Then, a child's voice rose from the crowd. "May I speak, mister?" Silence fell, and all eyes turned toward the tiny girl in the white hijab, her hand raised calmly toward the heavens. The silence inside the cathedral was suffocating. Even the cameras seemed to pause, their red lights blinking but unmoving. The crowd parted slowly like a sea, and from its center emerged a girl no taller than the altar steps. Aliyah walked forward with steady feet, her white hijab glowing softly beneath the cathedral lights. She clutched nothing in her hands. No books, no notes, just a fragile presence that somehow felt massive in that holy, hostile place. Father Leonard squinted at her with a confused smirk. "You?" he said. "You want to talk about God?" Aliyah nodded. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. "If I may." Some in the crowd chuckled nervously. A few whispered, "This is ridiculous." Others just watched, eyes narrowed, intrigued. Leonard stepped back and made a sweeping gesture. "Very well. Let the child speak. Maybe God will entertain us." Aliyah stepped onto the platform. The microphones adjusted automatically, yet she didn't lean in. She didn't need to. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to something inside her. Then, opening them, she began, "God is not someone you win with words." The audience blinked. The sentence was soft, but it hit like a drum. "He's not a theory, not a page in a book. He's not logic that bends to human pride. He is the one you meet when your voice breaks and there's no one left to hear you, except him." Father Leonard raised a brow, amused. "And how would you know that, little one? You're a child." Aliyah turned to him calmly. "Because when I wake up in the dark, I don't cry for my mother. I whisper to him, and I feel safe. Even when no one is awake, he is." She looked out at the congregation, her tiny hand resting on the wooden lectern that towered over her. "You study religion, mister. You read about prophets. You debate about faith. But have you ever sat completely still, with no words left, and felt your heart break from something bigger than yourself?" A woman in the third row gasped, clutching her necklace. Alaya's eyes softened. I know he's real, not because someone told me, but because when I place my forehead on the ground in sajda, something fills me that no words can explain. A love too big for my little chest. A man behind the camera dropped his headset. Leonard tried to interrupt. Feelings aren't facts. Emotions can deceive. But silence doesn't, Alaya said, cutting him gently. Silence never lies. In silence, your heart speaks, and mine keeps saying his name. The air thickened. No one moved. No one cheered. For the first time, the cathedral wasn't echoing with logic. It was trembling with something far older, truth. Leonard stared at her, something flickering behind his eyes. His lips parted, but no words came out. His world, built on steel logic and intellectual pride, suddenly felt paper-thin. How do you know it's God? He finally whispered. Alaya's answer was like a whisper into eternity. Because when I remember him, I feel found. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't blink them away. And if God could only be proven with arguments, then little girls like me would never know him. The room cracked, not in sound but in spirit. A priest dropped his gaze. A woman wept openly into her husband's jacket. Somewhere in the balcony, a man whispered, Subhanallah. And Father Leonard, proud, brilliant Leonard, took a step back, not out of anger, but something closer to surrender. For a moment, time stood still. Alaya remained motionless at the podium, her small frame almost lost in the shadow of the towering architecture. Yet her words echoed louder than the grandest sermon ever delivered within those walls. Father Leonard's fingers trembled as he gripped the edge of the pulpit. He tried to speak, but nothing came. His thoughts, a fortress of certainty, were now riddled with cracks, and through those cracks her words kept seeping in. I thought I knew God, he finally said, his voice low, as if ashamed to hear himself out loud. I've studied scripture, debated atheists, outwitted philosophers, but right now, I can't even respond to a child. Alaya didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped down, walked toward him, and gently placed her small hand on his arm. You don't have to respond, she said. Sometimes, the best answer is to just listen. The moment she said that, Leonard's knees buckled. And then, the unimaginable happened. He fell to the ground. A gasp swept across the cathedral like wind through dry grass. Father Leonard, unshakable, proud, undefeated, prostrated, face to the floor, not in mockery, but in something raw, something real. The same posture he had once mocked, he now embraced. The congregation stared in disbelief. No one clapped, no one moved. A silence took hold, not of awkwardness, but reverence. The cameras zoomed in, but even the media professionals felt like intruders to something sacred. Reporters stood frozen behind their equipment. A producer whispered into a mic, "Keep rolling, don't interrupt this." Leonard's shoulders shook, his face pressed into the stage, tears soaking the polished wood. When he finally lifted his head, his face was drenched, his eyes red, his breath uneven. I don't know what just happened, he admitted, but, for the first time in years, I feel like I'm not performing. He looked up at Alaya, his voice barely a whisper. What you said, it wasn't debate, it was something deeper. Alaya nodded quietly. It was remembrance. In the back of the cathedral, an elderly man began to sob. A woman clutched her chest and sat on the floor. Others followed. A spontaneous wave of emotion swept the room. Some bowed their heads. Others simply cried. And somewhere in the far corner, a mother whispered to her child, "Remember this moment. It's what truth looks like." But where there is awakening, there is also fear. Not everyone in the room was moved. Not everyone wept. In the front row, Dr. Samuel Bergen, respected theologian and close ally of Leonard, stood abruptly, his face pale with rage. "This is not faith," he shouted, his voice cutting through the emotion like glass. "This is emotional manipulation. You're letting yourselves be seduced by a child's tears." People turned to look, startled. Samuel's face twisted as he pointed at Elia. "She doesn't understand theology. She doesn't know doctrine. And yet here you are, folding before her as if she carries divine authority." But the crowd didn't rise with him. They remained still, their silence louder than any argument. Leonard stood slowly, facing his old colleague. "Samuel," he said gently, "for years I believed what you do, that intellect is the highest form of faith. But maybe, just maybe, real faith begins when intellect finally bows." Samuel shook his head and stormed out, his footsteps echoing alone. Elia turned to her father in the crowd. He was already crying, holding her mother's hand tightly. Beside them, Karim was speechless. In that moment, everyone knew something profound had just taken place. Not a debate, a turning point. A child didn't win an argument. She cracked open 1,000 hearts. The footage spread like wildfire. Within hours, every major social platform was flooded with clips of Elia's calm voice, Leonard's prostration, and the stunned silence that followed. Hashtags trended worldwide. News anchors stuttered through their coverage, unsure how to describe what had happened. "Child challenges priest," one headline read. "A miracle or manipulation," read another. But inside Elia's small apartment, the world felt colder than ever. The phone rang non-stop. Strangers knocked at their door. A reporter even climbed the fire escape to try to photograph the family through a cracked window. Yusuf covered the windows and turned off the lights. Karim stayed with them overnight, standing guard at the door. "This isn't fame," Yusuf muttered. "This is exposure." "They're scared," Karim said. "And when people are scared, they attack." Across town, Leonard Gray sat in silence at a retired priest's countryside cottage, hidden from the public eye. His church had placed him on indefinite leave. His social media accounts were frozen. His email deactivated. The man who once filled cathedrals was now alone, scribbling thoughts into a notebook he never intended to publish. "All my life," he wrote, "I searched for God in books and missed him in whispers. I wielded logic like a sword, and in doing so, I wounded my own soul." Back in the city, the backlash intensified. Politicians weighed in. Secular groups called the event an orchestrated stunt. Marcus Helstorff, head of the anti-faith advocacy group Fortress Europe, held a press conference calling the event an existential threat to Western identity. "This was no coincidence," he thundered. "A child trained to manipulate. A priest set up to fall. We must investigate this family, their origins, their beliefs. The West cannot be infiltrated with emotion dressed as faith." That same day, Yusuf was fired from his job without explanation. Mariam, who taught Quran privately, found parents withdrawing their children. And Aliyah, she remained quiet. She no longer played with her dolls or drew flowers in her notebook. Her eyes, once bright with wonder, now carried weight. Not fear, something deeper, responsibility. One evening, she walked into her father's room while he was staring blankly at his unplugged television. She climbed onto the bed and sat beside him. "Abby," she said gently, "why do people get angry when someone speaks the truth?" Yusuf blinked, surprised by the question. He looked at his daughter, so small, yet so far from naive. "Because truth shakes things," he said after a long pause. "People build their lives on beliefs they've never questioned. When someone makes them question it, they feel like the ground beneath them is cracking." Elia looked down. "Did I do something wrong?" Yusuf's voice caught. He pulled her into his arms. "No," he whispered. "You reminded people of something they forgot. You didn't break anything. You just showed them the sky they stopped looking at. But he knew, deep inside, that this wasn't over. That night, men in dark coats were seen parked across the street. A drone hovered for hours before buzzing away into the dark. Karim took shifts sleeping by the window. The pressure mounted until a letter arrived from the government. It was a summons, a formal review of their residency, a deportation hearing. Mariam wept silently in the kitchen. Aliyah didn't cry. She just walked to her prayer mat, laid it out, and stood still beneath the cracked ceiling. She whispered softly, "Ya Allah, if this is the path you chose for me, help me walk it without fear." Outside, the city lights flickered, and somewhere, in another apartment, a stranger watched the video again and cried. The day of the hearing came like a storm. Rain drizzled over the gray courthouse steps as Yusuf, Mariam, and Aliyah stood outside, surrounded by a small circle of volunteers from the local mosque and a few strangers who had silently joined their cause. Leonard, dressed plainly in a worn coat and scarf, stood beside them. His eyes were tired, but his presence was firm. "I'm not here as a priest," he told Yusuf. "I'm here as a witness to truth." Inside, the courtroom buzzed. Media outlets filled the back rows, cameras rolling. On one side sat Marcus Helsdorf, polished and smug, flanked by lawyers and government officials. On the other side, Yusuf clutched Mariam's hand while Aliyah sat quietly between them. She looked at the judge without blinking, her small body still, her face unreadable. The prosecutor rose first. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, clinical. "This case is not about religion," he claimed. "It's about national security. A foreign family with unverified affiliations is using a child to influence public opinion. This isn't faith, it's propaganda." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And your evidence?" Helsdorf's team and presented a slideshow of clips. Aliyah at the podium, Leonard kneeling, news coverage spinning with speculation. "We are not questioning her sincerity," the prosecutor said, "but sincerity can be dangerous when it is used to manipulate the masses." Aliyah didn't flinch. Then their lawyer stood, calm, composed. She spoke not from anger, but from clarity. "You claim this child is dangerous, that her words sparked unrest. But all she did was speak from her heart, in a place that invited open dialogue. You say she manipulated thousands, but maybe, just maybe, she reminded them of something they lost." She paused, then turned to the judge. "Since when is remembering God a crime?" The room fell quiet. Then, unexpectedly, a witness stood up from the back row. It was Clara, an elderly woman who had been in the church that day. Her voice trembled, but her conviction was solid. "I was there," she said. "I came to watch a debate. And instead, I watched a miracle." The prosecutor objected. "She is not on the witness list." "She's on mine," said the defense. Clara faced the courtroom. "That child didn't twist words. She spoke them like music. I felt something I hadn't felt in 50 years. Peace. If you deport her, you're not protecting us. You're silencing hope." Tears filled her eyes. And some of us waited a lifetime just to feel that again. In the corner, Leonard exhaled slowly. One by one, other voices began to rise. A journalist from the media pit stood and admitted that he, too, had cried while editing the footage. A former atheist whispered a quiet confession of belief. Even the stenographer paused for a second, brushing away a tear. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Hundreds of people holding candles, some with placards that read, "Let her stay," and "Truth has no borders." Back inside, the judge looked down at Aliyah. "Do you have anything you want to say?" Aliyah stood. Her voice, though small, filled the chamber. "I'm not a danger," she said. "I just remembered God out loud. If that scares people, maybe it's not me they're afraid of, but the silence that follows." The room froze again. Not a single camera blinked. And in that moment, every soul watching, whether in the courtroom or behind a screen, understood. This wasn't a legal battle. It was a test of whether a child's light could outshine society's fear. The judge leaned back in her chair, silent for a long moment. No rustle of paper, no typing, just the weight of a room holding its breath. She glanced over the evidence again. Not the files, but the faces. Yusuf's quiet strength, Mariam's trembling hands, Leonard's broken humility, and Aliyah, sitting still, her eyes not afraid, but patient. "I have heard enough," the judge finally said. Everyone tensed. After careful review of the testimonies, the submitted evidence, and the broader social implications, her voice grew steadier. This court finds no legal basis for deportation. This family has the full right to remain in this country with complete protection of their religious freedom. The words hit like sunlight through storm clouds. There was no cheer, no eruption, just silence. Pure, tear-filled, stunned silence. And then Mariam sobbed. Yusuf collapsed into his hands, whispering prayers of gratitude. Karim exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into applause, chants, and cries of joy. But inside, Aliyah simply stood. She walked to the judge, bowed her head, and said, "Thank you for listening with your heart." The judge blinked away the tears building in her eyes and simply nodded. Later that day, in the small park near the courthouse, a gathering began. Nothing official, just people who had witnessed something sacred. Leonard stood beside Yusuf, looking out at the crowd of mixed faces, ages, and beliefs. "This isn't the end," he said. "This is the beginning of something we all needed." Mariam sat on a bench, holding Aliyah in her lap. She kissed her daughter's head gently. "You were never just a child," she whispered. "You were a reminder." Yusuf joined them and placed a hand over Aliyah's. "We thought we were small, but God used our smallness to shake walls we didn't even know existed." Across the park, people who had never met were hugging, exchanging phone numbers, planning interfaith meals. Something had shifted. An invisible wall had cracked, and love had poured through. But not everyone was celebrating. In a cold office lined with black marble and steel, Marcus Hellstorff watched the court footage again. He paused at the frame of Aliyah's face. The stillness, the light, the serenity that no strategy could counterfeit. He clenched his fist. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Faith like this, it spreads." And he was right. Over the next weeks, churches, mosques, and synagogues across Europe began holding community dialogues. People began asking real questions, not just about religion, but about purpose. And in those conversations, Aliyah's name returned again and again. Some called her a miracle. Others called her a mystery. But those who met her knew she was neither. She was simply honest. In the quiet of one evening, as the world continued buzzing outside, Aliyah sat alone on her balcony, staring at the stars. She held her prayer beads gently and whispered, "Ya Allah, I'm still small, but I want to be the kind of small that reminds people of you." A wind passed softly over her face. Downstairs, Yusuf was making tea. Mariam was humming a lullaby. The house, though still under watch, still cautious, was filled with peace. Because now they weren't hiding light, they were carrying it. And across the world, in homes and hearts they would never see, that light had already started to flicker awake. Aliyah didn't change the world with anger, protest, or power. She changed it with remembrance. And that kind of change doesn't fade, it multiplies. The dry wind blew gently through the olive trees as the dusty taxi wound its way up the narrow road toward Kasbat al-Nawur, a remote Moroccan village tucked in the Rif Mountains. Dr. Leila van Dijk, a Dutch physician and tuberculosis researcher, sat quietly in the back seat, gazing out the window at the unfamiliar terrain. She had left behind Amsterdam's sterile hospitals and efficient trains for a world that felt centuries older. As the car stopped at the edge of the village, Layla stepped out and was immediately struck by the silence. No traffic, no distant sirens, only the wind, the occasional bray of a donkey, and bird song. The peace was so complete, it was almost unnerving. Then came the sound that would haunt her first few nights, the adhan, the Islamic call to prayer. A clear, piercing voice echoed from the minaret of a nearby mosque, rising above the rooftops and reverberating across the hills. Layla flinched. To her ears, unaccustomed to such sounds, the adhan was loud and intrusive. It pierced the serenity she expected from a quiet village. She didn't understand the words, but she felt them press against her spirit. She frowned, unsure whether to be offended or unsettled. A woman in a white hijab greeted her at the small clay house she'd be staying in. "Welcome, my daughter. My name is Yusuf. You are safe here, inshallah," she said with a warm smile and outstretched arms. Inside the home, everything was simple. Bare walls, woven mats, a small gas stove, and a Quran resting on a high wooden shelf. Yusuf prepared sweet mint tea and fresh bread, offering it with genuine hospitality. Layla forced a smile. The old woman seemed kind, but Layla couldn't help but feel alien. Everything smelled of spices, incense, and old wood. That night, as Layla lay on a thin mattress, jet-lagged and restless, the Fajr Adhan echoed before dawn. She sat upright in bed, heart pounding. "Why is it so loud? Every single morning?" she whispered to herself. The next morning, bleary-eyed, she joined Yusuf for breakfast. The old woman smiled and spoke softly. "The call to prayer wakes the heart before the sun. It's a gift." Layla didn't answer. She was here for science, not spirituality. She had come to study TB outbreaks, not to immerse herself in religious customs. Yet something in the woman's peaceful demeanor unsettled her, not in a bad way, but in a way that made her realize how little peace she had actually known. The village, the mosque, the call to prayer, it all felt overwhelming. And yet, as Layla sipped her mint tea and watched the villagers pass by, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important, something beyond her science, was about to begin. The sun rose slowly over Kasbat al-Nur, painting the adobe walls in warm golds and reds. Layla stood on the veranda outside Yusuf's home, holding a clay mug of bitter black coffee. The early morning air was cool, crisp, and carried the scent of freshly baked bread from nearby homes. Children passed barefoot, giggling on their way to the small village school. Men in long jalabas walked calmly toward the mosque for the mid-morning prayer. Everything here moved with a rhythm Layla couldn't understand. She had spent the past few days visiting homes and meeting local patients suffering from tuberculosis. Many of them lived in cramped spaces, shared water, and lacked proper ventilation. From a public health standpoint, it was a disaster waiting to spread. And yet no one complained. Everyone welcomed her with smiles, offering figs, dates, or strong mint tea before she could even sit down. But despite their kindness, Layla felt a growing tension within herself. Every morning and evening, the adhan continued to echo, each time pulling her out of thought, out of rest, and often out of sleep. She began to resent it. The muezzin's voice, filled with devotion, felt like an invasion to her secular mind. Why did it have to be so loud? Why 5 times a day? One night, she voiced her frustration to Yusuf. "I don't mean to offend," she said cautiously, "but why does it have to be shouted like that? The call to prayer. It wakes me up every time. I don't understand it." Yusuf gave her a gentle look. "It is not shouted, my daughter," she replied softly. "It is called, like a mother calling her children to eat, or like the earth calling to the rain." Layla blinked, not expecting such a poetic reply. "The adhan? Yusuf continued, reminds us that life is more than this body, that every heartbeat is borrowed. It invites us to pause and remember. Layla didn't respond. The explanation was beautiful, yes, but it didn't ease her discomfort. She was a doctor, a scientist. Her world revolved around bacteria, diagnoses, and statistics, not mystical calls or invisible truths. Later that week, while walking through the market with Yusuf, Layla noticed something strange. A blind man tripped on a stone near the vendor stalls, and within seconds, two young men rushed to help him. No one laughed. No one ignored him. People paused, waited, and helped. That night, Layla wrote in her journal, "This village, though poor and old, is full of dignity. I don't understand how. Maybe the Adhan does something to them. Maybe it connects them in a way I can't measure." She closed the journal and laid down, listening again to the Isha call to prayer echoing through the village. This time, she didn't cover her ears. Instead, she listened. Not with understanding, but with curiosity. The days in Qasbat al-Nur began to blend together, marked not by hours on a clock, but by the rhythm of prayer, market chatter, and the humming of life. Layla had started to adapt, if only a little. She still wore her jeans and long-sleeved shirts, but she now covered her head lightly with a scarf when walking through the village, mostly out of respect for the elders who greeted her with such sincerity. One afternoon, as she sat beneath a fig tree outside the clinic she'd temporarily set up, she heard a clear, melodic voice from the mosque courtyard. It wasn't the Adhan this time, but something softer. A man was teaching children how to recite verses from the Quran. His tone was calm, patient, and beautiful. Even Layla, who didn't understand a word of Arabic, could feel the serenity in it. Curious, she walked closer and peeked past the stone wall. There, sitting with a group of barefoot children on woven mats, was a young man with kind eyes and a trimmed beard. His posture was gentle, and his presence felt magnetic. "That's Yusuf," said a voice beside her. It was Yusuf, smiling as if she had expected Layla to ask. "My grandson. He just returned from Fes after completing his studies at a madrasa. He teaches the children here now." Layla nodded, her curiosity piqued. That night at dinner, she finally met Yusuf properly. He had come to greet his grandmother, bringing fresh herbs and dates from the market. Yusuf, always 3 steps ahead, invited him to sit and eat with them. Yusuf spoke fluent French, which made conversation easier. Layla was initially reserved, but Yusuf's calm manner encouraged her to open up. They spoke about Morocco's public health issues, his work in the village, and her TB research. Then came the moment Layla didn't expect. "Do you still find the Adhan disturbing?" he asked gently, his eyes sincere. Layla hesitated. I suppose I'm getting used to it," she admitted. "It's still loud, but now I find myself listening. I don't understand it, but it doesn't feel like noise anymore." Yusuf smiled. "That's a start. Understanding often begins with discomfort." He then explained the meaning of the call, how each word was a reminder of divine presence, how it wasn't just a ritual, but a heartbeat for believers. His words were not preachy or forceful. They were honest, as if he were sharing something precious. Layla listened in silence. Something stirred in her, not agreement, not yet, but a strange warmth. After dinner, she found herself lingering on the rooftop of Yusuf's home, watching the stars. The wind was cool, and the sound of distant laughter echoed from the streets. The Isha Adhan rang out once more, Yusuf's voice leading it tonight. It didn't shake her awake this time. It soothed her. It reminded her not of religion, but of presence. For the first time, Layla wondered, what if there was more to truth than science alone? The weeks in Qasbat al-Nur began shaping Layla in quiet ways she hadn't anticipated. The clinic she had established in a dusty corner of the village had now become a space where both medicine and conversation flowed. Villagers would come not only with fevers and coughs, but with warm greetings, homemade bread, and questions about her homeland. Children ran barefoot through the alleyways, their laughter echoing like music through the sunlit fields. But Layla's focus had shifted. Though her TB research continued, her evenings were now filled with different inquiries, about words she heard in the Adhan, about the meanings of certain gestures in prayer, about the verses Yusuf recited to the children. It wasn't that she was converting, she told herself, she was simply curious. Yusuf often visited the clinic to translate for patients or just check on his grandmother. He was never pushy, never preachy. He simply existed like a well-rooted tree, calm, steady, full of shade. One afternoon, they sat together under a grapevine trellis behind Yusuf's house. The air was heavy with the scent of mint and damp earth. Layla took a sip of her tea and asked without thinking, "Do you ever doubt?" Yusuf smiled. "Of course. Faith doesn't mean the absence of questions. It means trusting there's a light, even when you can't see the path." Layla looked away. "I've always believed in evidence, in data. But here, everything is different. People trust what they feel, what they can't prove." "That doesn't mean it isn't real," Yusuf replied softly. "Isn't love real, even if you can't measure it?" That evening, as Layla walked through the village, she noticed something had changed in her. The dirt roads no longer felt foreign. The mountain winds no longer bit at her skin. The Adhan, when it rang out at Maghrib, didn't shake her. It slowed her down. She paused at the door of the mosque, where Yusuf stood with the local imam. He smiled as he saw her but didn't wave. She felt no pressure to enter, but also no fear of approaching. That night, in her journal, Layla wrote, "The people here live slower, but somehow they seem to feel more. They laugh more freely, cry more openly. They listen to silence like it speaks. I came to study a disease, but I think I'm studying something else now. Maybe myself." The next morning, before sunrise, Layla awoke. Not to the Adhan, but to stillness. For once, she didn't roll her eyes or bury her head under the pillow. She sat up, pushed open the wooden window, and listened to Yusuf's voice rise in the dark. "Allahu Akbar. God is greater." She didn't know what that truly meant, but she wanted to, and that yearning felt like the beginning of something new. Morning sunlight crept across the stone walls of Kasbat al-Nur as Layla stood barefoot in the garden, feeling the cool soil beneath her feet. It had become a habit, stepping out before breakfast, watching the village awaken, and listening to the final echoes of the dawn Adhan fade into the breeze. What once felt like noise now carried meaning, even if unspoken. Yusuf joined her, balancing a tray of warm mezzamen bread and honey. "You seem quieter these days," she said with a knowing smile. "Your heart listens more now." Layla chuckled gently. "I think I'm still trying to understand what it's listening to." That day, a storm rolled over the mountains. Rain came fast and hard, turning pathways into rivers and forcing most villagers indoors. But Layla stayed at the clinic late, tending to a young boy with a chest infection. As she cleaned his cuts and wrapped him in dry cloth, the boy's mother held her hand and whispered, "May Allah bless you." It wasn't just a phrase. It felt like a prayer. Later that evening, soaked and exhausted, Layla returned to Yusuf's home where a fire had been lit. Yusuf arrived not long after with extra blankets and herbal medicine. As they sat near the fire, sipping lentil soup, Layla looked at him and asked, "Do you think I'm changing?" Yusuf met her eyes with warmth. "I think you're remembering. Not something from your past, but something your soul always knew." Silence fell between them, not awkward, but soft, like an unspoken agreement. Outside, the call to prayer began once more, echoing gently through the rain-washed village. Layla didn't flinch. She listened. "I don't understand every word," she said, "but I feel like it's calling me too." Yusuf didn't reply immediately. He let the moment breathe, then said, "When the heart begins to lean toward truth, understanding follows. Faith isn't forced. It arrives like rain, quiet, necessary, and full of mercy." That night, Layla couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, watching the mosque illuminated by a lantern's dim glow. Memories of Amsterdam flashed through her mind. White walls, sterile hospital lights, a life structured by science and control. And yet here, amidst dust, prayer, and olive trees, she felt anchored for the first time. The next morning, she asked Yusuf a simple question: "Will you teach me how to pray?" His face lit up, not with surprise, but with quiet joy. He didn't lecture. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "Come." Inside the mosque courtyard, under Yusuf's patient guidance, Layla learned to wash her hands, her face, her feet. She stood facing the Qibla, mimicking his gentle movements. She didn't know the words, but she followed the rhythm. And when she bowed for the first time, forehead nearing the ground, a strange calm swept over her, like she was returning something heavy she'd carried too long. It wasn't conversion, not yet, but it was surrender, of ego, of noise, of everything that once kept her from asking, "What if there is more?" Weeks passed, and the village of Kasbat al-Noor no longer felt foreign to Layla. It felt like home. The sharp edges of her skepticism had softened. Her mornings were no longer defined by resistance to the adhan, but by waiting for it. The sound now marked the rhythm of her days, gentle, persistent, and strangely comforting. One evening, after the Maghrib prayer, she and Yusuf sat beneath a pomegranate tree outside the mosque. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of firewood and orange blossoms. Children played nearby, and villagers passed with warm greetings and soft smiles. Layla turned to Yusuf. "I used to think faith was blind, but here, I see it in everything, in kindness, in patience, in your grandmother's hands when she serves tea, in how you speak, not just to people, but to silence." Yusuf looked at her, his expression calm. Faith is not blindness, it's sight of a different kind. Layla hesitated, her voice lower. "I want to say the Shahada." He didn't react with surprise. Instead, he placed a hand over his heart. When your heart is ready, Allah opens the door. The next morning, in the small prayer room of the mosque, surrounded by Yusuf, a few village women, and Yusuf standing respectfully nearby, Layla whispered the words slowly but clearly. "Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. The room was silent for a moment, and then filled with smiles, tears, and the quiet echo of Allahu Akbar. Yusuf embraced her tightly, eyes moist. "You were always meant to find your way here, my daughter." In the following days, the village seemed to glow. Layla chose the name Noor, meaning light. It was Yusuf who suggested it, fitting for someone who had brought warmth to their clinic, their people, and now to their faith. Layla continued her medical work with renewed passion, but her purpose had expanded. The clinic became more than a place of healing. It became a space of compassion, where faith and science worked side by side. Yusuf and Layla taught together, him with scripture, her with knowledge of the body. One day, as they watched patients leave the clinic, Layla turned to Yusuf. "I used to think I came here for research, but now I know. I came here to be healed." Yusuf smiled. "Healing comes in many forms." That evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, the adhan rang out once more. Layla stood in stillness, facing the Qibla, ready for prayer, not just with her body, but with a heart that had finally found its direction. In Kasbat al-Noor, beneath the call of faith and the canopy of stars, a Dutch doctor had become Noor, not just in name, but in soul. And her journey, though deeply personal, had only just begun.